would like to call to order the workshop meeting in the Board of Directors of the Vallecitos Water District for Wednesday, September 9, 2020 at 3 p.m. And briefly, those of you who are already on have figured out how to get in the public who have figured out how to get on board. You're aware that we are still following the Governor Newsom's executive order to do teleconferencing. So any of you who have not sent in a request ahead of time to speak, please use the raise hand function that should be shown on your screen. And there are also additional instructions online that are posted on www.vwd.org/meetings. And I'll start with the roll call. Director Martin, are you here?
Present.
Thank you. Director Ellithorpe.
Present.
Director Hernandez.
Present.
Director Sinella will be arriving late, as already discussed by him, and I'm here as well. Okay, so I want to welcome all of you, and we, at this time, I believe, do we have anyone to speak on an issue that's not on the agenda?
I don't see anybody expressing a desire to speak at this point.
Okay, well, no one wishes to speak. Does that include the consultants?
Well, I think the consultant would like to speak, but not yet.
Oh, okay. So we need to adopt the agenda for this workshop meeting. Would someone like to make a motion?
Hernandez, move to approve.
Thank you. It's been moved by Hernandez and second by Martin that we adopt today's agenda. Roll call. Director Martin?
Yes.
Director Ellithorpe?
Yes.
Director Hernandez?
Yes.
And I'll say yes as well. So it passes with 4, 1 absent. Okay. And with that and no public comment, which I jumped ahead of, we will move directly to the item for discussion, which is a workshop to discuss the cost of services. And we'll hand it over to you, Glenn, to start it off, and then I'm sure you're going to pass it on to our consultants. Thank you for being here, everyone.
All right, so good afternoon, President Evans and members of the board. Today's workshop is the first step in the development of a cost of service study. A cost of service study is a document that develops fair and equitable ways to collect revenue from district customers to pay for district expenses. To help us, the district retain the services of Vallecitos Incorporated, a renowned expert in the preparation of cost of service studies. We're not going to be talking about specific rates today, and we won't be talking about tier allocations or specific percentages of fixed versus variable or any other specific topics like that. What we do want to do today is to find out from the board what pricing and policy objectives you value most. Today, you will be asked to provide us with your policy priorities. And then in the coming months, Vallecitos will work with staff to develop a couple of rate structure alternatives that will be guided by those policies that the board gives us today. As we discussed during the budget adoption, we assumed any new rate structure would be in place by February 1st of next year. Today's discussion pertains to water rates only. We don't anticipate the need to adjust rates on the wastewater side of the house for the foreseeable future. So unless the board has any general questions for me, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sanjay Gar, who's a vice president with Vallecitos, and maybe just a little bit about him. And I think he'll be turning it over to John from their shop. But Sanjay may look familiar to some of the board members. He's a frequent presenter at utility conferences like Aqua. He's a graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, so that's pretty impressive. And he's been a member of the American Waterworks Association's Rates and Charges Committee, which is kind of the Bible for rate setting. So I think we got the right consultants. I think they're really going to help us through this process. And with that, unless the board has anything, I'm going to turn it over to Sanjay.
Good evening. Thank you for those nice words. Wish we were able to meet you in person, but unfortunately, given the situation we're in, we're doing this virtually. As mentioned, today's really objective is to talk about policy, and it's about what kind of what do we want to achieve with our rate structure? What makes sense in our community? As we know, we have to comply with Prop 218. So whatever rates we develop has to be cost basis. There has to be a rationality behind it. We have to look at the cost structure of your business and then appropriately allocate those costs to your customers. But within that framework that we're talking about, within Prop 218, we do have some room to design rates that meet your specific needs. And as policymakers, as the board of directors, what we're looking for you is direction on which policies make sense for you. John Wright will be leading a presentation on this. I'll be chiming in intermittently. And staff has also provided us guidelines on what they think is appropriate, but definitely we want to get your input on that. Once we receive your input on the policy, and we want to have a really good, healthy dialogue on this, you may need some time to think about this too. Then we're going to look at those policies, and then we're going to ask ourselves, the technocrats, what rate structure makes sense to meet those policies. So that's what the goal is of today's study, and also talk about what is cost of service. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and he'll lead the presentation, and I'll be chiming in as needed. And John is in our, let me just introduce John since I was introduced. So John is a senior manager with Vallecitos. He's in our Marietta office, just down up the hill on 15. John has over 20 years of experience. He's worked both in the consulting sector and on the public sector. He actually worked for one of the largest utilities in the United States, Denver Water, doing rates there. Very technical knowledge on the rate making sides, and working a lot with different agencies in California, and recently just finished with the city of San Diego, a very large study.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having Sanjay and I here to discuss these issues with you. Before I get started, let me make sure that everyone can see our presentation in full screen mode. Glenn, are you seeing that okay?
Yes, we are, John.
Terrific. So Glenn and Sanjay did a great introduction in terms of what we hope to achieve. And one is to tell you about this comprehensive water rate study that Vallecitos is undertaking for the district. And then the other is, as Sanjay indicated, to get your feedback on what you feel is important for your water rate structure to achieve. So some of this, our introduction to the project team, we've already discussed, but we'll go through various facets here talking about what the rate study is, what some key policy issues are, what cost of service really means, and then we'll look at your current rates, and then we'll really hopefully get into a discussion with you on what you consider are important objectives for your water rate structure. So we've had great introductions. Glenn provided a great introduction for Sanjay, and Sanjay provided one for me. So there's not too much more to say other than, of course, we both are based here in California, which we think is an important thing, just in terms of knowledge of California regulatory requirements and some of the unique needs of California utilities. So when we think about the comprehensive water rate study that the district has hired us to complete for you, comprehensive in this case really means a detailed look at your revenue requirement components, the amount of revenue you need to collect from rates, and how all of those costs are allocated in order to develop rates that are paid by your end user customers. And as an outcome of this study, in addition to really looking in detail at the cost allocations, we hope to define for you up to 2 alternative water rate structures that meet the board's desires for what you would like to see. And of course, within that context of developing alternative water rate structures, we need to consider cost recovery, key financial and rate structure policy issues that are related to cost recovery. We need to make sure that we comply with California regulatory requirements, most notably Proposition 218. And as Glenn mentioned, the hope is to have rates that are effective on February 1st, 2021. As sort of a side outcome of this whole study, Vallecitos will be developing for district staff a new Microsoft Excel rate model, which hopefully Glenn and Wes Owen and the members of their team can use for future water rate design and cost of service activities on an internal basis. So what do we do in a rate study? Well, here's what we're going to do within the context of the study for the district. One is step one, which is really where we're at today with our workshop, which is discussing pricing and policy objectives and getting board guidance on what you consider important in the rate structure. Step two is to analyze revenue requirement components. We'll be using the district's budget as a starting point. And for Vallecitos, just like most water utilities, water supply costs are an exceptionally important cost driver in terms of the amount of dollars you need to collect from your ratepayers. In order to basically develop alternative rate structures, or for that matter, structure your current rates appropriately, we need to really understand customer demand. And there's all different ways to look at customer demand, obviously by meter size, by customer type. And as an outcome of that customer demand, it'll help us start to define how our tiers, for example, if we have an inclining block rate structure, should be structured. Step four is where we really get into the sort of intricate cost allocations, which we'll be talking about later in the presentation, and design to alternative rate structures. And then step five is sort of the pro forma development of a detailed report that provides an excellent defensible administrative record for the district, the Prop 218 notice requirements, and the Prop 218 hearing. So sort of a five-step process. So when we think about doing water, or for the matter, municipal sewer rates in the state of California, we are under a regulatory construct here in the state of California that we need to make sure that we comply with. Number one is Proposition 218, which governs municipal water and sewer rates. And the key issue with Proposition 218 is that rates need to be cost-based. Prop 218 defines cost-based rates on a parcel-specific basis. Proposition 26 doesn't really define municipal and water and sewer rates, but it does define certain other types of miscellaneous charges. Perhaps the most important Prop 26 rate that we would deal with are groundwater rates. California Government Code 5499 governs how utilities charge other public agencies. For example, if you were providing water and sewer service on a wholesale basis. Then in addition to the regulatory requirements in California so that we really achieve cost-justified rates, we also need to comply with the state's overarching objectives to promote water conservation / water use efficiency. And if we looked at Article 10 of the California Constitution, we'd see an emphasis placed by the state on water use efficiency. Senate Bill 606 defines targets for water use. I think the target by 2023 for all agencies is 23 gallons per capita per day for residential indoor use. And I think the ultimate target is 50 gallons per capita per day. Sanjay, jump in. I think that's a target we want to achieve by 2030 in the state. And then finally, the State Water Control Board requires utilities to certify that they have adequate supplies over a 3-year period, which was an outcome from the shortages utilities across the state encountered during the really severe drought we had. So kind of the California context that we wouldn't see in other jurisdictions. And so rate making and cost of service in California, rate design are, I think, more complicated and more advanced than they are in other parts of the country. So one of the very important sort of trailblazing cases as it relates to the development of Proposition 218 compliant utility rates was a case involving the city of San Juan Capistrano. And this is where a taxpayer association sued the city over its water budget rate structure. And Orange County Appellate Court initially ruled that those rates did not meet or comply with California regulatory requirements. And one of the things the court noted was that there wasn't an adequate administrative record that could be relied upon by people investigating the rate structure to understand exactly how the city of San Juan Capistrano came up with its water budget rate structures. And there wasn't an adequate justification for the rates they had by pricing tier. And Sanjay, I know you played a role in this. Do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about what you and Raftelis did within the San Juan Capistrano context?
Yeah, sure. So we, just a clarification, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We did not do the initial study for San Juan Capistrano. Another firm did that, that got them in this pickle. When they were in the midst of that trouble, they went through an RFP process, and we were selected. I was the project manager on that study, and I assisted the city in developing a rate structure that met their goals. Similar to what we're doing today with the pricing objective and getting those inputs up front so that before we start doing analysis. One of the challenges, the two takeaways I've learned, the one takeaway, besides the administrative stuff, is that, you know, and this is just from other experience with working with other cities and water districts, is that if you usually know getting sued shouldn't be a surprise. These are people who you know in your environment. And so if you know someone who's always sort of a thorn in your neck or someone who's active, you should anticipate something may occur. So that's why, you know, that's why the district went through the length of hiring us. We're going to do our due diligence. We're going to make sure we meet the requirement of this court ruling, which is that there's a nexus and a rationality. Rates can be arbitrary or capricious. It's standard. That's the way I like to think of it, make it simple. So whatever our cost is, what's our rate, there's a logic, rationality there. And we're consistent with that logic and rationality. And then we have an administrative report that clearly explains that, because someone in your public will read it. There's a few people who will read it. I don't know them, but they will read it. And so we want to, you know, be prepared for that.
So Glenn did a great job of explaining cost of service. And so here's another sort of slightly alternative take on it. But basically, when you think about water utility customers, they generate different costs, or put another way, the utility incurs different costs to serve different types of customers. And one of the key reasons that this is the case is that customers of different classes, or in some cases meter sizes, impose different peak demands on the utility. So if you have a customer class that does a lot of outdoor irrigation, for example, they're imposing a heavy peak maximum day or maximum hour demand on the utility infrastructure. And it costs more for the utility to serve that customer class than it does a customer class, for example, that doesn't impose peaks. And so what cost of service attempts to do is attempts to take the amount of revenue the utility needs to recover and allocate that amount of revenue to customers based on the demands they impose on the system. And you see that second bullet point, there's a matching of rates charged with the cost of serving each group. And the third bullet point is really the key, that we want to make sure that different types of customers are paying for the service they're receiving and the costs they're imposing on the utility. And we want to, as much as we can, eliminate any cross subsidies between different types of customers. And what this slide does is it kind of shows us this concept of cost of service. If you look at the graph on the right that's labeled usage characteristics, you'll see two different water utility systems. And those two systems both have a demand of 10,500 acre feet per year. But you can see that the demand of 10,500 acre feet associated with the system that's signified by a red line, that level of demand occurs with a high concentration of demand in the summer irrigation season, let's say June through approximately October. The second system, which is represented by the blue line, they still have the same level of total demand, but they don't have the peaks. And so if we were engineers and we were designing the water utility system to meet the demands of these two usage profiles, we really have to have significantly larger infrastructure in terms of treatment capacity, storage, pumping, to serve the utility in red with a very high peak loads. And we could have smaller, less costly infrastructure to serve the utility in blue that really doesn't have heavy peak loads. And this graph is kind of the essence of cost of service and why it is. And I think it's important to note that, cost of service is not something that we just do for water utilities in the state of California. Historically, cost of service analysis and charging customers rates that are aligned with the cost they impose on the system is something that electric and natural gas and sewer utilities, as well as water utilities, have been doing for decades and decades. And it really underlies the way utilities are regulated in this country, and it underlies fundamental utility finance and economics. So here's a little animated slide that kind of asks or shows how we might allocate costs. So when we think of cost of service, I want you to think of the annual amount of revenue that needs to be recovered from ratepayers. And that, of course, is driven by the district's budget that the board approves. And when we know that annual amount of revenue, we have to allocate the costs that we need to, that we incur that are associated with that revenue to various components. And so what Sanjay and I will do is we will go into an analysis that says how much of the costs that the utility is incurring that are reflected in its budget are associated with water supply. How much of those costs are being incurred to meet base or annual daily demand, annual average demand? How much of those costs, for example, are conservation related, or are we incurring to meet peak demands as defined by max day and max hour? So it's kind of an initial step in the cost of service process. And once we've identified why costs are being incurred, we then have to distribute those costs to customer classes based on their unique demand characteristics. So how much are they using on an annual basis? How much does each customer class use on a max day or max hour basis? How many meters does each customer class have? How many bills do we have to send out? And we then distribute those costs to our customer classes. And that establishes the amount of revenue we need to collect from each class, which brings us to the third step, which is developing rates for each class, which is where we are on this slide. So you think about the rates that a customer class might be paying, whether it's single family residential or industrial or irrigation only. It's really a combination of the demands they impose on the system and how much water supply or a peaking extra capacity costs or conservation costs are. And that gets us to the class revenue requirement, and then ultimately we divide by units of service to come up with our rates, in this case dollars per 100 cubic feet.
John, if I can interrupt real quick, I just want to let President Evans and the board know that it looks like Director Snella has joined us.
Thank you. So Sanjay and I thought it'd be a good idea to go over with the board the district's current rate structure. And so right now for your water commodity rates, we're in a situation where we charge the following rates down at the bottom, and you can see them there: Tier 1, $3.77 per HCF, Tier 2, $4.75 per HCF, and Tier 3, $9.18 per HCF. And we charge those three commodity rates by tier, but what we do is we define the level of water customers receive in each tier based on their meter size. So for example, for customers with 5/8 inch and 3/4 inch connections, their tier 1 consumption width, it goes up to 6 HCF or CCF. They pay $377 in tier 1. In tier 2, that next tier is 7 to 21 HCF. They pay $475 in that tier. And then for usage of that's at 22 and above in tier 3, those customers would be paying $18. And you can see the way your current rate structure is set up is that as customers move to larger and larger meter sizes, they have increasingly larger consumptions tiers. They're in tier 1, 2, and 3. And so, some interesting issues associated with Vallecitos that Sanjay and I have not dug into to any significant degree yet are questions related to the allocation and recovery of water supply costs. Particularly an interesting question is the recovery of costs from the Carlsbad desal plant. Another interesting question are the consumption tiers associated with irrigation customers, especially larger meter customers, and to what extent those consumption tiers are appropriate. Now, we do have the RTS structure. I would just think of those as monthly fixed charges. Those go up by meter size. Those recover your fixed costs. They recover, for example, the cost of things like meter maintenance, customer service, customer billing is in there. And the reason these charges are structured to increase by meter size is that customers with larger meters are allocated more costs based on the level of instantaneous demand they can impose on the system. So a customer with a 6-inch connection can crank up that connection and impose a very heavy instantaneous water demand on the system, much more than a smaller meter size customer can. And I'll say that this notion or this current setup of having monthly fixed charges that increase by meter size is very, very common. The district also has agricultural customers. Glenn, I have to admit I need to become more familiar with what these two categories are in terms of non-participating and participating. But basically what we have for these two types of ag customers is a uniform rate structure. There's no tier. So this is another part of the district's current rate structure. And also not shown on here, you have pumping surcharges by elevation that basically reflect the collection of electrical costs the district incurs to provide water service to customers at different elevation levels in the district's service territory. I went through that very, very fast. Questions or comments or thoughts on any of that?
Are there any questions at this point? I think not, John.
Okay. So when we think about pricing objectives in water rate structures, it's just as Sanjay indicated, we're working within the context of California regulatory requirements, most notably Proposition 218. But utility agencies can still seek to achieve certain objectives with their rate structures as long as they're cost-based and fully defensible within the constraints of Proposition 218. And the interesting thing about policy or pricing objectives, whatever term we want to use, is oftentimes they're in opposition to each other. So for example, if we looked at the top line, you see revenue stability. And so utility financial managers, and I used to be one, and I work with them all the time, are often very keen to ensure that they have an adequate amount of fixed revenue coming in every month and every year. They like to have revenue coming in from fixed charges because it's not tied to consumption levels. And so higher fixed charges enhance utility revenue stability, but the offset to that is higher fixed charges can often create affordability concerns, especially for low consumption customers. customers. And so if you're a customer that has a 3/4 inch connection and you don't use much water, and the utility increases your monthly fixed charge from $20 a month to $30 a month, that's a larger bill that you have no control over. And so that creates this affordability concern. Another key sort of dichotomy in terms of pricing objectives is the notion of financial stability versus conservation. And so to the extent that we can justify it on a cost basis, we will have rates that in the top tier, that top marginal tier, are often significantly higher than the rates in the lower tiers. And you can see that for the district. Your tier 3 rate is much higher than your rate in tier 1 and tier 2. And so that sends a cost-based conservation price signal. The bad news is that in certain situations, for example, if we had an exceptionally cool, wet summer and you didn't sell as much water, you would see a decline in your overall level of water revenues. Similarly, if you had to impose drought curtailments and you weren't selling water in the upper tiers, you'd have less water sales revenue. So having a cost-based tiered rate structure sends a great conservation price signal, but in certain climate conditions, it may impair utility financial stability. And as it relates to administrative ease and equity, well, I guess in theory, we could develop equitable water rates that might be more complex than the utility billing system can handle, or that utility staff feels comfortable and competent in handling. And at the same time, we have key pricing objectives like legal defensibility. We want to be in compliance with California regulatory requirements, and customer understanding. I'm not sure those two are in opposition, but definitely revenue stability, affordability, financial stability, and conservation would be great examples of opposing objectives. So really, this is just a look at some pricing and policy objectives, varying all the way from achieving customer conservation / water use efficiency to ease of administration. And I'm not going to read all of these for you, but associated with each major objective, there are certain critical sub-objectives. And so I will just perhaps focus on affordability in the middle. Well, to the extent we can, we want to minimize the impacts customers feel from increasing water rates. And oftentimes utilities will define that as wanting to achieve two separate affordability objectives. They want to maintain water bills for average consumption customers that are as low as possible. And this is driven by the allocation of costs and the development of cost of service rates. To the extent that you have customers that have very, very high usage for outdoor irrigation, they impose high peak demands on your system. Well, it's going to cost more to serve them than it is an average customer. So having the objective of low average customer bills is generally aligned with cost of service. And then utilities will also want to craft rates that are as affordable as much as they can be for essential water use. And this would be especially for a lower consumption customer, but really all customers need a certain amount of water every month for non-discretionary indoor usage. So to the extent we can maintain affordable rates for that essential water use, that's really a good thing. So one of the things Raftellus asked Glenn and his executive team to do is to think about the district's system, your service territory, your customer demographics, financial challenges that you face, water supply issues. We asked them to identify what they felt were the most important pricing and policy objectives they would like to see achieved with a water rate structure. And here is that ranking, 1 being the most important, enhancing revenue stability, down to number 8 at the bottom, providing a drought management tool. And what I think is really interesting, and Sanjay, I'd like you to jump in here as well if you feel it appropriate, is the district executive team does place a strong emphasis on affordability, both for essential water use and average customer bills. And the executive team has also placed an emphasis on cost of service equity. This is the equitable allocation of water supply costs that you incur, as well as the equitable allocation of capital costs. And recognize these pricing objectives that the executive team has come up with are not the only pricing objectives that they could have listed. There could have been many other things, but these are the ones that they felt were the most important. And obviously, the reason we're here is to get the board's input on what you consider important.
And John, just to chime in here a little bit, I mean, so one of the, this is our challenge, this is why you hired us, but we'll figure it out, is that as John mentioned, there's sometimes conflict between pricing objectives. And so one of them is enhancing revenue stability and affordability. And so that'll be on us. We'll have to figure that out and come up with some creative solution that meets within the Prop 218 framework. But we're up for the challenge. That's why we like doing our work. But as John mentioned, staff has given us this direction, and the way to think about this is like it's sort of like which way do we go? Do we go north, south, east, west? And so we're looking for a roadmap. Which direction do we want to go? And these are policies, so that's where the board comes in, and we want to know, does this make sense? And we do have a little homework for you, so sorry about that, to fill out. And there's different ways to do this. One is a discussion approach. Another one is to fill out the homework. So you're in charge, so you could always rebel against the teachers. So.
What this next slide shows is for the pricing objectives that were identified by the executive team, some sub bullets of what are often considered important subcategories. You notice there's only 6 boxes here. In the previous slide, there were 8 objectives. And the reason is 2 of the staff's objectives were related to affordability, and also 2 other objectives related to cost of service equity. So I hesitate to go through these, but I am going to anyway, just because they're really important. I promise I'll try to do it as fast as possible. We want to generate adequate level of revenues, and as much as possible, we want to have stable cash flows. So not only do we want an adequate level of revenue that meets our budgetary and financial sufficiency needs throughout the entire year, but we'd like as much as possible to have stable cash flows without a high degree of variability. And affordability, we've talked about that, essential use, average customer bills. Rate stability is really an issue of trying to craft rates that don't whiplash customers, where we don't have a lot of volatility as we move from rates one year to the next, or a lot of volatility as we tweak our rate structure. And therefore, that allows us to kind of minimize customer impacts. When you think of it in a non-residential context, to the extent that you're a business where water is a big cost of production, you want to have some certitude regarding what you need to budget for next year. And I sort of see rate stability as kind of a reflection of providing that signal to non-residential customers as they budget. Of course, it's important for residential as well. Interestingly, under cost of service equity, we not only have this notion of equity between customer classes, which is the second bullet, for example, cost of service being costs being allocated in a fair and equitable manner based on the demands they impose on the system between customer classes. So single-family residential, for example, gets allocated costs that are appropriate based on the demands they impose. Non-residential customers get costs allocated to them based on the demands they impose. So there's a notion in that middle bullet point of equity between classes. Another interesting question, though, is equity among customer classes. And in California, it's a legal requirement, and very, very important, that we have a cost basis for the rates in each tier. So if we're going to charge $10 per HCF in our upper tier and only $1 per HCF in tier 1, we have to have a cost basis for that, and that's equity within a customer class or among a customer class, such as single-family residential. The third bullet on cost of service equity, this notion of intergenerational equity. You know, utilities have to make a decision as to how they finance capital costs. And in some utility contexts, capital, growth-related capital is paid for by property taxes. But other utilities use capacity fees to help pay for the cost. Depending on how you finance that long-term capital investment can create or harm equity between current and future customers. Customer understanding, those are three pretty easily understood. I won't go over them. And when you think about demand management, there are demand management issues regarding utilities that want to control their usage on an annual basis because they have water supply constraints. There may also be utilities that would like to be able to control the peak demands of customers because they have infrastructure constraints related to meeting that max day and max hour demand. And then sort of demand management, under that heading also falls this notion of utility revenue stability and sufficiency. So just kind of a high level with some of the sub-bullets under the objectives the executive team had identified. Sanjay, I think I'll ask you to speak up. I think you kind of gave the board the option of filling out these pricing worksheets or perhaps doing this on a discussion basis.
Yeah, and so this is up to the, we did request the board to fill this out. So we could either, you can do this now and maybe fill it out and then email it to us, and then we would compile it at the next board meeting and present that result. The other option is you could tell us and we can have a discussion. We can also look at what staff provided and use that as a benchmark and see if we agree with that approach. And you may have some suggestions there. So I'm giving you three options, which one you would like to do. But we do want to get your input, and because this is sort of the foundation of the study. I just want to be a little bit clear about that. So because we're going to be using this to help articulate rate structures.
Right. And if you were to fill out this worksheet and rank the staff objectives based on what you consider the most important, what Sanjay and I would do is, of course, we tabulate those rankings and develop a score that would show us what the board holistically considered the most important objectives from 1 to 8. So I think we have the capability to do that if you want to go through and fill it out. Glenn and Wes, if the board did that, would you be able to collect those and email them to us?
Yeah, certainly we could do that. So I guess President Evans, I'll look to you. Is there a preferred method? We could take 5-10 minutes, whatever the board thinks is appropriate. You could each be thoughtful in your own place and just rank these 1 through 8. There's eight objectives here, and then we can reconvene. Or conversely, we could you could submit those after the meeting, whichever seems to appeal to the board the most.
Well, my preference personally is that we fill it out after, because I would like to know what staff's recommendations have been based on how they put this together. And I don't feel like I want to take time out of the Zoom session to do that. But I would leave this also up to the rest of the board members. So yes, Director Hernandez?
Yes, I agree. I would like to do this. I don't have my computer. I have the laptop, and so my emails are somewhere else. So doing it after the meeting would be preferable for me.
Okay, how about you, Director Sinella?
Yeah, I would agree. Good plan, Director Evans.
And Director Elitharp?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And Director Martin, are you comfortable with that too?
I'm very comfortable because I'm interested in knowing what providing a drought management tool means.
What it means?
Yeah, what does that mean? It can mean 1,000 things to 1,000 people.
Oh, okay. Can that question be answered?
Sure.
So I think we'll pass this to you and we'll make an effort to do it very, in a timely manner for you, gentlemen.
Okay,
And at this point, I'd like to just go ahead and move forward.
let me take
Thank
a
you,
crack at drought
all of you.
management tool. Let me take a crack at drought management tool, and I'll have Sanjay jump in to add what he feels is appropriate. You know, when you go into a drought situation, one of the things you may have to do is curtail consumption on the part of your customers because you don't have a water supply availability. And there are some rate structures that allow utilities to implement drought restrictions and develop drought rates in a manner that is easier than might be the case with other rate structures. Because whether you're in a drought or you're in normal climatic conditions, we need to make sure that as much as possible, any rates we charge are cost-based, and we need to have a rational, justifiable reason for curtailing consumption. And so perhaps if you had a rate structure where you had 3 tiers by customer class, currently you have 3 tiers by meter size, but I'm just throwing out 3 tiers by customer class as an example, we could try to develop those tiers in a manner such that as you implemented drought restrictions and move from, let's say, stage 1 to a very severe stage 4 drought, that there'd be a reasonable basis for restricting consumption at each tier level and a reasonable basis for developing rates at each tier level that would be understandable to customers, that would be equitable, and that also, as much as possible, would try to or would allow the utility to maintain some degree of revenue stability. And there are just certain rate structures that are more conducive to implementing drought restrictions than others. Sanjay, additional thoughts on that?
No, I think that's very comprehensive. I mean, the key question to ask is, should rates be a tool to assist you during droughts? Or do you use other tools in your tool belt for that? And so that's the question we want to know. And some people say, yeah, rates should help us with that. And some people say no.
Director Sinella, was that a hand raise?
It was. Thank you, Director President Evans. Hey, John, you kind of touched on this a little bit during your presentation, but how much flexibility do we actually have with the ready to serve fixed fees? Because probably the complaint that I hear the most from our customers, especially our residential customers, is that it's the low water users, right? It's the, it's the senior citizen who is widowed, living by themselves, and they use very little water, but yet their fixed water portion is $36 and some change, and then you add on their sewer component, and their bill is never less than $75. And they're living on a fixed income. So I've always understood in my time on the board that a lot of those fixed costs are driven by our infrastructure costs, and that we didn't have a lot of flexibility. But can you clarify that for us?
I think I would agree with that in general, the fixed charge is a reflection of the fixed cost the utility incurs to maintain service. And that I don't see a lot of cost shifting from, for example, fixed cost recovery to volumetric rates. If a utility was to do that, I think they'd have to have a very, very good conceptual reason for it. And that alignment between fixed costs that don't vary with consumption and your fixed charges provides you with a fundamental level of revenue stability that you need to deal with things like climatic variability.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the short answer is there's not a lot of flexibility.
That's my answer. I'm interested in hearing if Sanjay has another take on that.
Yeah, what I would like to get is the board's policy on these objectives. And based on those objectives, then we can decide which is the appropriate rate structure. I have, based on the community we worked with, I have developed rates where the fixed charge was significantly lower. It was only 10% of the revenue. And 90% of it was from the commodity. That does expose you to a lot of revenue instability. But that community, that's what was sort of demanded on the community. I've also done the opposite, where I've increased the fixed charge significantly, where it collect almost 50% of the revenues, and then 50% on the commodity. My personal feeling is they both can comply with Prop 218. There needs to be that rationality, that story there behind it. But again, the way to navigate through those policy decisions is through this process, because this will help us determine what makes sense. What are we trying to do? Because we can't do everything, unfortunately. So we have to prioritize and decide what are the top 3 things that we really care about, and then we can definitely achieve those top 3.
And President Evans, if I can jump in there.
Yes.
So Director Sinella, for your example, if you as a director felt that affordability for a mobile home resident, for example, was your most important priority, then you'd probably be looking at the second line item here. You'd say, okay, that's affordable water for essential uses. They're only going to be using 2 to 3 units per month. What can we do to help them? So you may choose to make that your number 1 priority. So that would kind of steer us in a direction within the constraints of Proposition 218. Is there a way for us to develop a rate structure that helps that group over maybe a different, maybe the third group, which is low average customer bills? And those may be somewhat in competition, but so we're trying to solicit from the board which are the objectives that are most important.
Understood.
Go ahead.
I just said understood.
Okay. I was going to say, I think it's real important that we hear where staff was coming from so we can choose this, put our individual priorities in perspective on this and what we mail back to you. I appreciate you saying that, Glenn. And I also assume if there's something that's missing, we would include it in wherever we felt the placement should be. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what John is sharing, the screen he's sharing, I believe is the results of the staff grading or ranking. So we took, I think it was 15 or 16 criteria. We boiled it down to 8, and this is the average ranking. So John referred to the executive team. It was Mike Arthur, Wes, and myself that did the ranking, and we kind of averaged ours, and we came up with this final 8. And part of that was just to make it a little easier for the board to digest. I mean, if we threw 15, 20 objectives out there, it makes it that much more difficult. So we used our professional recommendation to kind of shortlist it to 8. We did give it a ranking, but that doesn't mean that the board can't, reshuffle the deck with these 8. They might want to say, hey, we really think that affordable water for essential uses is the most important thing that we have going on. And that's fine. Just we need to hear that from you. Otherwise, absent that input, Raftellus would probably take this ranking that staff came up with, but we certainly want to hear what the board has to say.
I appreciate that.
Just a comment on, just real quickly, I sorry to cut you off there, President Evans, but just a comment on the process. If the board were to take President Evans' recommendation and that after the meeting, the board would submit their ranking to staff, we would then assemble that, pass it to Raftellus, and that information would become part of the administrative record. So the public would know what the board did. So we want to be fully transparent in this process. So we'll share the outcome of the board's ranking system with the public at the same time we share it with our consultant.
Thank you for that. Are there any more comments from the board members or questions?
I had another question of staff.
Director Sinella?
Hey, Glenn, the category of revenue stability, I can certainly understand why you and your finance team would rank that number one, but can you educate me as to what benefits that might bring to the customer?
Well, I think the
Other than having maybe I don't know, financially healthy water district, but other than that, is it more of a, for lack of a better way to put it, convenience for you guys?
No, I think it's not so much for us as staff level. I think part of my answer was going to be what you just said. It's to make sure they have a healthy utility, because all of our customers rely on Vallecitos for their water and wastewater needs. They need to make sure, they need to know that we're financially solvent and we're ready to provide a high quality of service. It does provide some side benefits to the public revenue stability in that it's fairly predictable what their monthly bill is going to be. They don't want a structure that one month they're paying $10 and then the next month they're paying $190 unless they had a significant change in water consumption. So it's good for it to be predictable and stable for both the customer and the utility.
Thank you. Any other questions or concerns, comments? That you, Director Martin?
Yes, Glenn, you just answered that, and I'm looking at number 6, rate stability, minimizing customer impacts. Why wouldn't that be number 1 instead of enhancing revenue stability? Again, coming from a director's perspective rather than employee's perspective.
Yeah, arguably these 8 could be in any order, but from my perspective, and I think from the team, Wes and Mike and myself, our number 1 objective is to make sure that the utility remains fiscally solvent and viable. We want to make sure that the revenue's there to make sure that we can continue to provide high quality services. Then there's a secondary question of where does that come from? And I'm not saying that's less or more important, but we were looking at it more holistically and big picture, and that's why enhancing revenue stability kind of rose to the top.
If I can chime in here, sorry. So this is a classic example of what we're trying to get at, is this challenge, because you can't have everything. So you have to choose one. And what happens is that, I mean, these are all important, but some of them are, so this is the sort of, sorry to do this to you, but a little pain we're going to make you go through in trying to figure out which one makes sense. Because this is, and then based on this, we can really design a rate structure. So we do want you to take time. Yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were done. Could you perhaps give an example because of there's certain levers in their cost of service that you guys can pull depending on how these policies are set, and what would be the difference, for example, in how you'd adjust those levers if you were pursuing enhancing revenue stability on one hand versus if the objective were rate stabilization?
So revenue stability, definitely that would be helping with increasing most likely the meter charge, the fixed charge. Rate stability may be more about reserve targets and trying to make sure we have enough reserves and a rate stabilization. So that's one example. Usually we do this in construct with other things too. So, and the other one is with rate stability, maybe also looking at water sales and asking ourselves, maybe we should assume a relatively smaller amount of water sales than we normally would have to make sure that we always sell that amount.
If I could, I think it's real important for us to keep in mind that this, what do we want to call it? This ranking at this point is simply it's always difficult. We all get confused on the words, but I think we need to remember when we're talking policy that we're going to be looking at the bigger picture and the greater good for the greatest number of people. But I also think it's very important that each one of us as the board members, when we rank ours, we make it very clear what, and maybe we don't just put them in a different order. We may want to include specifically what we're talking about, because that's part of the problem of reading this, as Mr. Gilpin just pointed out. If we're not sure what enhancing revenue stability is versus rate stability, it's very difficult for us to know comparing them. So if any of us in the process want to explain what we're looking for with rate stability or affordability, I mean, maintaining a low average customer bill, I think right now we're ranked in the middle average of the county, but are we comparing ourselves to what? Each other, the nation, the counties? I mean, there's all kinds of things that can enter into that. So I just hope we can all keep that in mind, and that as board members, we remember it's policy, not detail, but we make it clear what we're speaking about, because these are good questions, and it's a very difficult, as they've already told us, a very difficult subject. Anyway, are there any more comments? Did you have some, Director Elitharp?
Yes, I did.
Okay, you're
Yeah.
on.
Okay. I had another question of staff with regard to the ranking that they did, and it relates to the two cost of service equity items. The water supply cost one is at ranking 4, and the allocation of capital costs is at 7. I'm just curious why the disparity in rankings there. To me, they kind of go hand in hand. So.
Well, I'll speak for my 1/3 of the vote as we got together on that. Is I think our water supply costs are so unique compared to other member agencies of the County Water Authority, in that our desal costs are a very expensive commodity. So the question of how do you allocate that particular tier of water supply costs amongst the tiers and amongst the customers. Unlike capital, which is very similar to other agencies, that capital is what it is. You know, it costs a certain amount of money, but it kind of provides a general benefit to everybody. So you have limited ability on how you allocate those capital costs. But the desal, for example, should we be treating it as a fixed cost? We're buying that desal water whether we use it or not. We entered into a contract. Should that be part of our fixed costs, or should it be all on commodity? If it's all on commodity, is it all in tier 3? Did we only buy it for the excessive users, or did we buy it as a base supply? Should it be in tier 1? So I felt that desal question was really important, and that's, in my mind, that's what that water supply cost is really getting at, is how do we deal with the desal? Most of the complaints and concerns we hear from the customers is about excessive tier 3 usage and the cost impact it puts on a customer. And you saw before, and when John was going through the slides, we have a big jump between tier 2 and tier 3 costs. And that's mostly because the vast majority of our tier 3 costs, or the vast majority of our desal costs, are placed in tier 3. And that's fully defensible, it's fully legal, but it's a choice point that the board should at least weigh in. So I think in my mind, water supply costs are different than the capital costs, and that's why I ranked it higher. And I think Mike and Wes saw it similarly, because it did rise above the capital cost.
Okay. Yeah, I would just offer an opinion on something else. If you emphasize affordability, I think necessarily you have to get subsidizing between customer classes. I don't think there's any way around it.
I'm sorry, you're saying affordability almost always results in subsidies.
Yeah,
Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Greg?
the way I see it, it does.
Yeah.
I think it maybe Sanjay can touch on this, but you have revenue offsets that you use that could be used for affordability rates that aren't impacted by 218. That's probably the only way you can do it.
Correct.
there are revenue offsets within the budget? Is that what it is, Sanjay?
Yes, you may have other sources of revenues that don't fall under Prop 218, such as property tax, other sources that you could use to help reduce certain tiers. Other
So for
thing is,
example, some agencies will take their property tax and they'll allocate that as a revenue to tier one rates for up to some level. And so those rates are lower than the actual cost of water because of the revenue offset. I think I've got that right, Sanjay.
and also one of the things we'll be looking at is allocating costs on the tiers and the rationality behind that. So we may, for instance, conservation program. I've heard some people argue with me that conservation should be only in the higher tiers. I've heard other people argue with me that conservation should be in all tiers. And from my perspective, both arguments stand. It's just which one do you think is appropriate? So based again on this pricing objective, we're going to use these within Prop 218 framework. We're going to navigate. So you know, our goal is not to design rates that subsidize other customers because that'll be in violation of Prop 218.
Question, Director.
If I may.
Yes,
I'll yield the floor to Director Martin there.
thank you.
Hi, okay, yeah, my question was, I thought that was interesting. Director Ellertharp answered what I always thought was true, that the only way you can give someone water for affordably less than anyone else is by subsidizing it from somewhere else, basically a social system. But now, the first time I've heard in 8 years, Jim Gilpin or anyone say, oh no, we do have money coming in from other sources. Perhaps you could give us a list of those monies, General Manager. I'm interested in knowing how much they are and what they are.
I'm gonna look to Wes for that, but property tax is certainly probably the largest one. There's investment earnings, but I don't know what category that fits into. And I don't want to mislead the board and at this workshop and let them think that something is more discretionary spending and not governed by Proposition 218. But Wes, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on most of the types of the revenues, but I don't know how much flexibility we have in allocating them. I guess they're already in our rate model and being allocated to customers. So the flexibility is a big question there. But yeah, property tax is one of them, investment earnings, annexation fees. You know, property taxes might be $2 million for the year. We also have the RDA revenues. So those are the sources of revenue we have besides, or the other sources of revenue that we have. Again, they're already built into our rate model, so the flexibility we have in allocating those, I don't know, you know, how much we have there.
Yeah, and I would say this is a good example of where, you know, we're trying to stay at a policy level discussion and pretty quickly you can get down in the weeds. But what I would suggest, if the board, as the entire entity said, we think affordable water for essential uses is important, then that's what we do with the consultant. We try to find ways to honor the board's policy direction within the constraints of Prop 218, and we would identify ways to accomplish what you wanted us to accomplish. We're not asking for you to, at this meeting, to determine which funding sources could be used. If you think it's important that essential uses be as low as possible, that's why we hired Raftellus. They'll help us figure out the way that we can do that within the constraints of Prop 218 and the limitations that we have at Vallecitos, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. Other agencies may have revenue sources that we don't have. So some other agencies may have more or less ability to provide affordable water for essential uses. Sanjay, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think you articulated exactly right. I mean, this is not a one size fit all. We want it's you have a cost structure and then you have policy, and both those combined together. I think you have one of your staff also wants to speak.
John, real quick, can you go back to our rate structure?
Sure.
And I want to reemphasize what Wes said too, is that the property taxes and the other revenue that's coming in, they are already offsetting our rates. If you can look, and this was frozen in time at the tier 1 rate, right now that at that time that this was created, VWD rate is actually -9 cents. And that's partially offset because of those property taxes and other revenue income. Right now, and this is probably 13 months ago, I'm not exactly sure, our average cost of procuring water was about $3.86, and we were selling the tier 1 water at $3.77. So I just want to make clear that we don't have additional revenue or new revenue in terms of property taxes and all the other things that we can use, that it's already being offset. Right now, I believe it's offsetting each tier probably equally. And as General Manager Pruitt mentioned, that we could have some other levers that maybe we put more of that offset into tier 1, which could potentially make it more affordable for low-income users.
Yeah, or maybe you have tier 1 only being 3 units, and you could have a bigger benefit for just those first 3 units. Maybe it's 20 cents or 30 cents for the first 3, and then you have a different tier that isn't, I hate to use the word subsidized, but it's not offset by other revenues.
Okay.
President Evans,
Yes.
I have a question related to the property tax issue. How much flexibility do we have to change the property tax rate?
That I don't know. I don't think we have.
Without an election, none. I mean, without a property measure, probably none, Craig, Director Althar.
Yeah. Okay, so it'd have to be a ballot initiative?
I believe so. I would have to look at your specific property taxes, but I'm 99.9% sure that it'd have to be a ballot type measure.
The reason I bring it up is some districts have chosen to go the property tax route to pay for such things as fixed costs and move that off of the monthly bill.
Yeah, and so that's a different, that's not a property tax, that's just a different way to assess the fee, the rates. So there is a lot of discussion in the water community, and you're not the first district that I've had discussion with. Literally the last 2 months, I've had maybe like 4 or 5 of these discussions where a lot of people are asking, well, maybe we should put our like a capital charge or some kind of fixed cost on every parcel based on potentially meter size. And so that, again, through the pricing objective exercise, we will get that. And like one community, that most likely is the way we're going to go, is putting that. Now there's some things we'll need to work with Jim with about just the legal framework, whether you can assess that on the property roll or not. You know, just there might be some constraints that we're not familiar with the district, but we just want to make sure you can do that.
Yeah, I'd like to see us explore that.
And just real quick, I wanted to add, if you do that, I mentioned that when we were doing surveys of the other agencies, it makes it hard to compare our rates to other agencies. There were some agencies that do have some of those fixed charges on the bill. And when I'm trying to compile the data, or when a consultant's trying to compile the data, if it's not extremely clear that they have fixed charges on their property tax bill, agency A may seem to come in $20 a month cheaper than we are. So going forward, if that becomes more and more the norm, it's going to be extremely hard to compare agency to agency.
Understood.
And I just want to confirm, if we were to put this on the tax roll, it wouldn't be that it would be an additional fee, or it would be taking the fee that we have under our ready to serve and putting it on the tax roll. It's not that we're still charging the same amount of money from a different source. We're not, and we have some discretion with how we spend it, but it's not like we're not increasing the taxes to do that, even though we are taking it away from the customer's bill, immediate bill. Is that correct?
Well, it's kind of a zero-sum exercise, right? And
yeah.
The cost of service study isn't trying to determine your overall revenue requirement. That's through the budgetary process. The cost of service study tries to figure out how do you collect that amount of revenue to cover your costs. So yeah, if we said, well, instead of putting it on your water bill, it's going to be on a property tax bill, the total amount of revenue collected would probably be what our budget determined it needed to be. I could see some customers may like it, some may see it as a hidden fee. Oh yeah, you reduced my water bill, but you increased my property taxes. So But at the end of the day, I don't think it changes the total amount that would be collected by the district.
Well, that I thought was the important point, because in a way, if we were to do that, which I'm not saying is good or bad, I don't really have a grasp of it, but it seems to me what we're saying, if we've been spending, we've been collecting $1,000 off of the low users or the people with low incomes, we're now going to get the $1,000 because we have to have the $1,000, but we're going to take it from people who own property. So if I were on a fixed income and I didn't own property, my bill would be lower because I wouldn't have as high a fixed rate. However, my neighbor who may own their property, theirs would be higher because they're paying a higher amount on property, and that's therefore taking care of me. So I think there's a lot of complexities in this and the issue, and I want to just remind myself that what we're going to do for you is tell you what we hope is, what we as a board want is most important. And then you will surprise us with either how lovely and easy or how difficult it will be for us to achieve our goals. And you've reminded us we won't get all of them, but we can certainly rank them, and we are free to rank them differently than staff did. I do want to say thank you for explaining the water supply number 4. I had no idea that was connected to desal. When I read that, I didn't think about that, Glenn. And I think it's very important that I've now got that in my head, because it's true. Though desal is an expense, no other district except Carlsbad, and even they don't have it in the same way we do, with that we've built our own pipes. So that was important to know to me. And I don't know if there's other things as we move forward. Do you explain, like, are you willing to explain each of these? Because obviously we've had some questions regarding each of these things. I think we now know what revenue stability is. And we know affordable water for essential users, maintaining a low average customer bill. That is confusing to me because I'm not sure what we're
So
comparing.
we have a memo with the definitions.
Okay, do I have that? I
Yeah,
probably
so
do.
it's the
I read
worksheet.
it 2 days ago.
Yeah, the worksheet was attached to the initial notification, the posting, and then I sent it out yesterday to the board members as well. So
Right.
there's some further explanations in the worksheet, but for
Thank
example, on
you.
the one with water supply, it doesn't get into great deal that it's about desal. So I think it was a valuable conversation. But again, that just, you got my thoughts today. You may have your own thoughts about where water supply would rank. I would encourage the board not to be guided too much by the staff rankings. You may want to consider them, but come up with your own rankings. If you think that these 8 should be in a different order, that's great. And if you wanted to pass along your thoughts as to why, or a question, that would be great too. One thing I think is really important, we're not trying to tie the board into anything right now. We're trying to solicit feedback. The consultant will use the feedback to develop a couple of different alternative rate structures. And then we're going to come back in a couple of months. It'll probably be mid-November, I'm guessing. And we're going to ask the board to look at what we've come up with. And at that point in time, we'll have much more specifics. We may get into, let's say the board overwhelmingly said affordable water for essential uses. And we interpret that to mean low volume usage. We may come back and say, hey, if you allocate 100% of your property tax to this, first 3 units in tier 1, you'd get this rate structure. We'll get into a lot more details about how we accomplished what you wanted us to accomplish. And maybe also explain the ramifications of that. So maybe other tiers had to go up because we focused on the essential uses. It's a bit like whack-a-mole, right? You knock it down somewhere and it may pop up elsewhere. And we'll do our best to explain those unintended consequences. But don't think that when you give us your feedback today or subsequent to today's meeting that you've locked yourself into anything. Sanjay, thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And just to give you some help with this, because we've done this a few times, is the one reason why we ask staff to rank it is that at least it provides you a straw person right? So you can at least see, okay, this is what staff says. So then you can reprioritize based on that. So that's one approach. The other approach you can do is start from new and just look at and ask yourself, well, what are the 3 things I really care about? And if that's hard to do, maybe do the opposite, which is, well, what are the 3 things I don't really as much care about? And then put the lower numbers there, and then start working backwards. So I gave you a couple of approaches here. You can either work from highest to lowest. Some people, it's easier to work backwards from lowest to highest, or for some people, it's easier to look at the staff and then say, okay, well, based on what staff said, I agree with this generally, but there's a couple of things I would change.
But I would ask, no matter what method you use, make your most important one number 1. Don't renumber them and say, well, I'm going to put 8 to my first priority. Keep your first priority number 1 and then descending down through number 8. Whether you work front to back or back to front, it doesn't matter to me, but the rank order numbers do at the end of the day.
Okay, gentlemen. Director Hernandez, did you have any comments? Because you haven't had a chance to speak. And does everyone understand what we're being asked to do?
No, I appreciate all the information, and I already did this once, but as I say, I didn't have it in front of me, so I'll send in my numbers 1 through 8, and we'll go from there.
All right, thank you. Is there any other concerns by the other gentleman?
Director Martin, I have a question. Are we at the end of this?
I don't
Sanjay?
know. Is there
Are
more
we
to
sure?
the presentation?
No, we're at the end.
Okay, then I do have a question
Okay.
for Sanjay. Sanjay, I've attended quite a few seminars where you have been a speaker, and I respect you very highly. You come across with everything very open, very fairly. Are you, or have you, or do you, or will you be looking at reserves?
I don't recall. John, are we going to be looking at reserves?
I believe that looking at reserves is something we'll do as we look at the overall amount of revenue that the utility needs to collect to maintain its financial health. And so not only does that mean costs like water supply costs or repair and replacement capital costs or customer service, but utilities do need to maintain a level of reserves. And so I would see that as something that we would be looking at within the context of understanding your revenue requirement.
Okay, and I have complete trust in our staff coming up with a reserve number, but I would like to hear it from a third person at arm's length as to what you think the reserve structure should be for an agency of our size with our needs.
Definitely we'll do that.
All right, thank you, Director Martin. Anyone else? Do the consultants have any other questions for the board members? Are you, Glenn or Jim?
I guess just maybe a timing question. So I'll look to Sanjay. So we're giving the board some homework, right? So you're going to go back and you're going to come up with your ranking. Is it reasonable to expect that by the end of this week?
That'd be great. I was going to give a little bit more time, but I think it's better to do it within a week, within the next few days, because that way we don't forget the discussion and dialogue that we've had.
Yeah,
The sooner you do it, better it is. It's one of those things like homework, right? You read the book, now you write your report. Don't forget about the book, and then start looking at it.
I have one more question.
Yes, Director Martin.
During the presentation, John, thank you very much for a great presentation. During your presentation, you stopped and asked us the question on elevated zone, on our zone pricing for our elevations. If we had any questions about that, were you asking if we understood it, or were you asking us for a policy decision?
No, I was not really asking for either. I just wanted to note that you do have those pumping surcharges, and they are based on electrical costs. and what it costs to pump water to different elevations in your service territory. So I really wasn't asking a question about it or seeking any policy recommendation. I was just mentioning that you have those in addition to your regular rates.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Director Martin, just as some clarification to that, staff did have that conversation with Raftelis, and we basically told them that Vallecitos staff would be managing the pump zone charges, and Raftelis could handle the other charges, and it maybe at some point in time they get coupled together when we do our Prop 218 notification. But in terms of who's doing the work, the pump zones will still be managed by staff.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there more?
I don't think so. If we can just maybe direct all the input to me, and then I'll coordinate it with the consultant.
Okay. Before I end the meeting, I'd like to say thank you for those who are in the audience. Have any of them raised their hands to make a comment?
Yes. Well, we had one hand that went up real quickly, Gail Martin, but the hand went down. So I'm going to see if she's interested or not.
Would you please? Thank you.
All right, Miss Martin, did you want to speak?
Yes, I would like to speak. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
we can.
Yes, thank you very much for the very instructive information and your consideration. I do have one question for you, please. What is the board doing to make sure the developers are paying for their impacts to our water district?
Would you like me to address that, President Evans?
I think it would be wise if you did.
Yeah, so we always separate the capital costs associated with development from the capital costs associated with maintaining the existing system for existing customers. Recently, the board did adopt new capital facility fees to ensure that development pays its own way. So going forward, developers will be paying to ensure that all the capital facilities that will be built in the future to support their development is paid by their fees. It's a long-term outlook. It's decades long of looking ahead, but was the board's policy direction, was to make sure that development pays its own way. So I hope that answers the question.
Hey, Glenn, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, and I don't know if you have the data right in front of you, but do you happen to recall? I seem to recall that we have some of the highest developer fees in the region. Do you happen to remember off the top of your head what where we kind of stand and as far as our developer fees?
I don't remember the ranking, and I know Wes is on the call, and I think James was there for a while. So if either of them happens to remember, we were near the upper end. We were at the high end, so we're charging more in developer fees than most of the agencies in San Diego County. I just don't know I don't remember exactly what the ranking was. Wes or James?
General Manager Broom, this is Engineer James Campbell. Yes, our water fees were just a little bit above average, but our sewer fees, in which our long-term capital outlook is heavy on new sewer infrastructure built to accommodate development, I think it's the third highest in the county at this time.
Yeah, I thought I seem to have recalled in recent years that we had some of the highest developer fees in the area. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, Mrs. Martin? Ms. Martin?
I muted her microphone, President Evans.
Oh, okay.
I would suggest
All right.
that if she wants to say anything more, she can raise her hand again.
That would be great. And are there any other hands raised?
She raised her hand again. Okay.
There you go.
Ms. Martin, are you back?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to know, when did the board decide that they were now going to start absolutely charging the developers the fees that they should have all along been charged? When did this happen?
Well, I would say that it's always been the board's policy. What we did recently was we revisited the fees to ensure that we are consistent with the board policy. So the board had asked me as general manager to ensure that that we were charging the right amount. We had a consultant study done, and it resulted in an increase in the rates to ensure that we were getting the money from development. So I wouldn't say it was a change in policy. It was just ensuring that the fees that we've established were consistent with the policy.
And when was this consistency applied?
James, do you remember the date of the capital facility fee adoption?
The rates went into effect January 2nd, 2020.
And it was a board workshop from October 2nd, 2019.
Does that help, Ms. Martin?
It does help. I don't know that I saw in any of the minutes where that occurred.
Yeah, they were both done at board meetings. So if you'd like to contact me after the meeting, then I can help direct you to the minutes and the meetings.
I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
President Evans?
Yes, Director Hernandez.
Just to assure Ms. Martin, we have always required, and I've been here in San Marcos 45 years, we've always required the developer to pay his share of the development costs and not burdening the existing customers with anything that is being necessary for their projects. The change of the fees, although they just took place here in January, we've always had a fee. We've just updated it here recently. So the developers have always had to pay their share.
And I would like to also say Jim's got that correct. We've always had a capacity fee, but we do have to review that capacity fee when we have our urban plan, urban plan management plan updates, when Sandag lets us know there's changes in development expectations and such. So I know there's a lot of confusion out there because I've heard some people say we haven't charged it. We've always charged it, and recently we actually raised it again, which is what you'll talk to Director Prum about when you speak with him. He can show you what we did and what the board decided on. Does that help? Is she muted again?
She is muted again, but
that's all right. Unless she raises her hand, it's all right.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out.
And that was the only hand, or is there another?
No, that was the only hand.
Okay.
Oh,
All right.
her hand's back up.
Pardon?
Her hand came back up. Miss Martin, are you there?
Yes, I understand that it's been at least since 2013 that development has not been paying their capital costs and that their fees have not been collected. We have had all kinds of money going into reserves, but we have not had the developers paying their fair share. So even though we have an increase in what we're supposed to be charging them, are we actually collecting that money?
Yes, we always have been collecting the capital facility fee from developers. We've never waived the capital facility fee for them. Different parties can always argue, is it the right number? And there's many ways to calculate these things. We believe the fees that we have in place right now are the right number, and we are collecting fees for every development that occurs within our service area.
Well, I know there's been a difference of about $7 million, and that is considerable money that the developers have not had to pay, and us ratepayers have been shouldering a burden that is not ours.
I would like you to take time, if you don't mind, and spend some time with the GM and also with our finance department if you need to. I think you have a very important question in front of us. I'm not sure that it really relates to the pricing and policy objectives of the of what this workshop is about. So would you you please make a schedule with her, General Manager Pruitt, and explain that to her and get her questions answered. And then if there's more questions, she's welcome to come back to another meeting or put that topic on an agenda.
And I'd be happy to do so. And I'll leave it to Miss Martin to reach out to me because I don't have any contact information for her. So she can just look up on our website and you can find my phone number and my email and reach out to me, please.
I will be glad to reach out to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my concerns and to afford me the possibility of communicating directly with you.
All right.
Thank you. All right. So then thank you, consultants, for an excellent presentation. And I want to thank the board for some good questions. You've certainly got my mind spinning, and we know we're to have our objectives in order for you by the end of the week, to you, right? Correctly? So I think with that, we are.
Director Evans, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
If I could just add one comment before we close down here.
Not, Wes. Okay.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I just would like to say, staff did this ranking that's before you, and we put enhancing revenue stability as our #1 criteria. And Director Martin actually made some great comments and observations that we did that, and he also brought up the reserves as well. So I'd like to just say that they're actually hand in hand, and we've actually provided the reserves to the consultants already as part of our budget. So they're looking at our 5-year plan, which is the reserves, and the operational costs are transferred into reserves. And that actually is going to establish our revenue stability by looking at our 5-year plan and saying, what do we have for revenues coming in over the 5 years? And is there any major projects that are happening? Are there major changes with the water authority or any other anything else like that that might affect the future of the district? That's all considered through the reserves and is part of enhancing revenue stability. Now, while looking at that, we also consider the impact to the customer, and it is a major consideration. So we have to look at the overall health of the district first, or it's how we look at our 5-year plan. And then we want to minimize that impact on the customer, and that's why it was a little bit lower priority in our ranking. That's staff's justification for the classifications, but that is both, it actually goes towards both of Director Martin's comments and observations.
Thank you, Wes. That was good to hear. All right, if there's nothing more, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you
Good
all.
night.
Good night. Have a good week.
Good night, everyone.
Thank.
Good night.
Bye, all.
Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks, John.
Guys.
You.